So moving on to the multilateral agencies, which are primarily UN, leaving the bilateral side for a moment. Thing to keep in mind about the multilateral agencies, again, which are primarily UN, is there are two groups within the UN. And if you remember nothing else from what I'm telling you in this lecture, you've got to understand that the UN has two very separate groups with very different mandates. One of them, the first one I'm going to talk about, is the multilateral UN, the specialized agencies. So the specialized agencies of the UN. Most of these agencies predate the actual founding of the UN in 1945 at the end of World War II, and they were all part of the League of Nations. The League of Nations was the precursor organization to the UN that was founded at the end of World War I, and that was found not to work very well because it was World War II developed. And at the end, or during World War II, the same countries got together and felt they needed another model, which is when they set up the UN, but with a very similar mandate to what the League of Nations had. Organizations at that time who had already existed, like FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization, or ILO, simply then took on UN names, even though they had been founded under the League of Nations. I like to explain their mandates in terms of world ministries. So we think in a particular country, in the US, for example, the Ministry of Agriculture is called USDA, the US Department of Agriculture. Think of that as a ministry, the way many countries would call it. So the World Ministry of Agriculture, responsible for agricultural issues worldwide, would be FAO, Food and Agricultural Organization. They're based in Rome. In the same context, think of the World Ministry of Health, for example, the World Health Organization. That's based in Geneva. ILO is labor, so Ministry of Labor. That's in this case ILO, based in Geneva. Other examples would be a World Ministry of Education. That's UNESCO. They're based in Paris. They all have very particular corporate cultures that are very unique to being specialized agencies. One is that they have assessed contributions. So the funding that they receive for their core business, for their core work, is based on an assessed contribution. It's a treaty obligation. When X country wants to be a member of that organization, based on their GNP, they pay a percentage to be a member of that organization and to basically buy and keep a seat around the table. And the table in this case is not a boardroom. It's quite large in many cases. It's a general assembly, so it's a large grouping of countries. They have separate governance from the UN overall. They have a Director General who is more or less equivalent to the Secretary General. The Secretary General technically is the head of the entire UN, but very close seconds in separate parallel structures are the Director Generals of the different specialized agencies. And the member states of each of these specialized agencies are not necessarily the same members of the UN. Not all countries who say they are members of the UN are actually members of all the UN agencies. So when a country is a member of the UN, that typically means they're a member of the UN Secretariat in New York, and they go to the General Assembly and to the different assemblies there. They may not necessarily be also members of the individual agencies, where their headquarters are outside New York. Also, we have the multilateral financial institutions, which are separate again, and they are the Bretton Woods institutions in particular, which are fairly well known. IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank. The World Bank, of course, is very much involved in international development, focused on the hungry poor and such. And then there's a third one as well, IFAD, the International Fund for Agricultural Development, that is similar to the World Bank but focused more on small scale and smallholder farmers, and is based in Rome, Italy. And then separately, another group, this is the other half of the equation that I was explaining, the specialized agencies, the other part of it, the other part of the UN you need to really understand is the development relief operations side, and these are the voluntary programs and funds of the UN. They are UNICEF, focused on children and mothers, UNFPA, population, UNDP, the UN Development Program. These three are all based in New York City, but they are not part and parcel of the UN per se, of the UN Secretariat in New York. They're separate headquarters in New York, but they are run by executive directors who are appointed by the Secretary General. And then UNHCR for refugees that are based in Geneva, and then the World Food Program based in Rome, and we're focused on food. These 5 agencies are the operational side of the UN. We tend to have very small headquarters, more active in the field, and that's where most of our staff are. We are very voluntary in that we have a completely different corporate resourcing model than the specialized agency and the Secretariat based in New York. Voluntary pay-as-you-go. The idea is that everything that we receive, all of those 5 agencies I mentioned, is purely voluntary. So you as a member state, you become a member and you sit around the table, in our case in an executive board. The executive director of WFP, in our case, sits around the table. She is appointed by the Secretary General, and in our case, special case, also jointly by the FAO Director General. And we are there to build confidence with you as our donors, as our member states, in terms of what we do, so that you will give us the resources that we need. There's no assessed contribution. There's no membership dues, if you will, that is paid for the UN in New York or for the specialized agencies. So it's a very different approach than what you have with specialized agencies and the voluntary programs and funds. So multilateral resources and funding. There's another distinction that's important to understand. The food and/or cash that will be given for the multilateral side obviously primarily comes from the bilateral donors. So the UN member states who can afford to assist, they will give that support. Some donors work and contribute to both bilateral and multilateral organizations at the same time. So for example, USAID and CETA and the EU and the UK, they will have programs that they support through USAID and CETA, DFID and such from a bilateral point of view, but they will also have separate contributions that they make to the multilateral agencies such as the UN, such as WFP or UNICEF. Oftentimes, it's not in competition. It's to complement many of these same programs with a bilateral and a multilateral focus. Some countries tend to be more bilateral or more multilateral. One example would be South Korea, the Republic of Korea, that has become much more of a player recently in international development, and they prefer to do it through their own bilateral South Korean agency, much more than through the multilateral channels. In the case of the Nordic countries, the Scandinavian countries, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Denmark, they are the other side, the other extreme, where they do have their own bilateral agencies that are very active, but they prefer to put most of their funding through the multilateral sources, the multilateral channels. And this is not just a funding resource distinction. You have to look at the issues behind those decisions. In the case of many of the Nordic countries, they feel that it's very important to remove what's considered to be a political or foreign policy, bilateral foreign policy objective from much of their funding. And that's why they feel if they go through a multilateral channel that there will not be those same considerations used in the programming, the same as it would be if it were bilateral. So there's a debate between many of the key donors around the world about this approach. Some decide to do both, some do more than others, some decide they prefer to do it all more through their own bilateral channels and use foreign aid more as a foreign policy tool. It really varies depending on the country.